Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kimaks, the Kyrgyzs, the Kipchaks, the early Gulams, even just as a type of trooper in the, not just in the steppes as you understand, but in the sedentary civilizations. Peoples that are somehow passing on the background where you start getting lost in this, say, time between the 9th to the 11th century. So before the affirmation of the Seljuks, after actually the disgregation of the Göktürks, aside from the survival of their Ashina dynasty that, as we've seen, was present also in the West with the Khazars, etc. And that, in fact, seem to remain. This is the moment in which the steppe seems to remain just more gradually differentiated, even from those peripheral areas that had seen the prior, let's say, blooming of in the previous millennium, let's say, at least of some of the most powerful, in fact, same steppes peoples and military culture remaining a little detached. So there is, as you will see from the pictures, also. It's an indicator, at least in terms of pop culture, the few amount of pictures about these peoples. Very often they start being considered altogether, also for the relative difficulty archaeologically to distinguish one especially military culture from one another. Says, this is a Turkic weapon ranging from the 10th to the 14th century, which is also normal given the say the very gradual technological improvement, right? As least as if we consider this, occurring increasingly over time. But naturally, the thing is more complicated. Anyhow, I tried to make in this series about Eurasian steppes warfare a bit of, at least to focus a little bit on the change in panoply, in generally speaking, these technologies and techniques, trying to connect them to how warfare changed. But remember that also in previous times, of course, technological changes were very, very slow, right? So there is not really a major watershed, if not the one we have spotted between the Indo-European and the Turkic-dominated phase of the steppes, right? So until the Mongols, where some things start coming around, and I did made a video about, say, Eurasian warfare between the Eastern Eurasian warfare, specifically between the 11th and the 14th century, when there's yet another wave and some kind of further legacy that is settled after that one for good at the end of the day, because basically those were the same years in which gunpowder was starting its journey, right, militarily wise, and so things would change significantly in the steppes as well, because these peoples, in spite of the originally feudal bias against firearms, that were mostly destined to the lesser troops. Whose stench remembered the one of sulfur, of course, the one of devil. Even in this mythology, we're actually quick to adopt these guns as well. It's something we have observed also in Ottoman warfare, that surely had its important share of steppe influence traditionally. So what we're looking at now is a very particular phase of stability, of not really staticity, because as we'll see, actually the political compaction of these peoples was basically never achieved, right? The biggest thing, again, had been the Göktürk Khaganate that actually was divided into two chunks, and that even within the same there were different tribes like struggling for power, and aside from the main dynasty, still there were lots of coups and internal and overthrows, let's say, and so on, right? So we're looking at just like when there is the full settlement, right, of the sea surface after a big wave, right? And you look at and see, okay, well, here the thing is somehow stagnating, and let's look at how it really is, right? And the peoples we discussed today are, in fact, the ones of the core, the heart of Central Asia, let's say between the Urals and the Lake Baikal, just to give you an idea. But important intersections, of course, both west and east of that, the other peoples, the Uyghur Khaganate, and others that, in fact, I haven't even been able to cover properly, for especially in the last couple of episodes dedicated to the Turkic peoples, because they're also somehow difficult, as I was saying before, to distinguish, to characterize, to properly say this is like an Uyghur warrior, and this is a Kyrgyz one, and this is whatever. We will see there are actually some features that explain a lot. Also, how spent and exhausted by a degree after this continuous waves the spaces were, right? Because we are naturally habituated to see even a bit on the wake of the the sanitary, millenaristic and eschatological and apocalyptic kind of prophecies, etc., based on the Bible, etc. This end of the world is populated by people that could just regenerate themselves and being sent by the devil from the bowels of the earth, as in fact the scourge of the same on the surface. But consider the amount of people that had been, of course, bred there, but that also had moved towards the outer side, right? This is a very impacting process, as we've seen. Most of these waves wouldn't make it to break through in the first place. So many of these people at the end of the day had been, even and their descendants had been killed, right? That's considering, again, the nomadic space, actually a much greater likelihood than in the sanitary one, even though we are shocked sometimes to see how many people could be massacred in a given time and space, because of course civilizations tend to strike hard in certain in certain targets that render the thing particularly impressive. But the constant and plain butchery that occurred on a large scale in the steppes is something that objectively was much higher in relative terms than whatever was happening in the sanitary world. In fact, that, again, as I already said in other episodes, the fact that these peoples wouldn't mostly write and tell us what was who, if anything, there, and how all their ethnogenetic processes were taking place, actually hides the fact that there weren't even some peoples that could tell us our story, because they have been literally wiped out along the way, and we basically don't give a damn about that, because we don't even know that they had ever existed, which is one of the most obscure things that we can imagine. But you can easily see from just even from the lifestyle, from the beliefs, from the warring techniques of these populations, how unspeakably and traumatically brutal the entire mindset, world, and reality of these peoples actually was. And for them, it was normal. Right, absolutely normal. For the sanitary civilizations already, again, all the medievalistic stereotypes of the terrible Dark Ages and all this kind of delusions. Actually, we lived in a sanitary world in a substantially civilized fashion, with a substantial degree of continuity of political power, of local stability, of general structuring, and possibility of surplus accumulation and all this stuff. In the steppes, really, things were pretty meager for anyone involved. So, looking at the times, the period between the 9th and the 11th century, we'll talk about this better in the following episode about the Vikings, the Varangians, and the Rus, is the moment in Eastern Europe in which, in fact, the early Rusian kingdom was arising and becoming firmly established. Right, a long process in which, as we've seen, the Turkic-speaking nomads, especially the Khazars, had been very instrumental, at least in the frontier. There had been a profitable competition / cooperation between the sentries, the nomads, to create a power like the one of Kiev that was able, in fact, even to crush the same Khazars eventually, and affirming itself as one of the largest powers of the time, right? But and so west of the Urals, you see still certain other populations dwelling, right, in the nomadic steppe, right, sort of equally large and warlike statal formations, in fact, taking shape at this point. Speaking of states is a big deal, but as we will see, as we have observed for the same Khazars, in fact, in the other episode, what is really happening is substantial degree of, if anything, territorial political establishment that in part, so these peoples remain largely nomadic or semi-nomadic, but they start also settling down, fortifying, right, and castelling. These are the centuries of encapsulation. In Europe, we know it better from the many videos I made on the topic. But this thing, interestingly enough, was happening in the same steppes, in places where fortresses had been existing by a degree. We've seen it since Scythian, Sarmatian times, but that were not really the norm, and they were mostly occurring in areas that mostly corresponded to, they were closer to civilization, that basically required that were essentially based on further bigger natural obstacles like rivers, and especially again in the close to their mouths, where again it was the frontier with the more advanced empires of the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. At this point, however, a type of feudal control starts establishing, at least on a much wider area. Surely Central Asia is more primitive and brutal, but this Western Eurasia, especially west of the Urals, many peoples that are not yet, again, there are Slavs mixed with them, but mostly they are still Turkic governments, right, that are controlling and would go on for a considerable amount of time, right? I made a video, for example, about the Volga Bulgars, right, and their very successful enterprise in a quite, in fact, culturally mixed area, right, between the Ugraphanes, the Slavs, and more. But that, again, are just beginning to, and eventually starting a slightly more sedentary kind of life, at least being forced by the contingencies to be able, fortunately, to accumulate more surplus thanks to the trade routes that are reactivating, or at least pumping lymph blood once again to a substantial degree transcontinentally. These powers are there, and they need fortified entrenchments to stock their goods that also have to be connected with one another. We've seen the Khazars start even a sort of armament standardization for the core of the Khaganal troops. So something that is a real political territorial power with various centers, in fact, trade centers mostly, where you can accumulate these resources and organizing them, administering them more or less from a top, right? They're still very unstable, there's no doubt about that, but generally speaking, they do work. They work enough to maintain a core of powerful armies to move around across a substantial space, summing that kind of level of power concentration with the traditional nomadic lifestyle. People being able to move literally with the entire possession from across thousands of kilometers in the steppes, because that's literally the only type of life that they had ever known, and it was the most natural thing in the world for them, and that objectively they didn't have any other chance to live like, right, compared. So one of these powers, even though again we're going more east towards the most civilized areas a bit are the Kimak tribe, the Kimaks. You find them spelled in different ways. In any case, this khaganate had emerged from the Kimak tribe, and it stretched at this point from the Irtysh River to the Tian-Shan, as we've seen the latter being literally, the pool from where some of the most successful peoples had either been bred or had passed through from the Alani to other Turkic populations. Some of the most ferocious, some of the most warlike, right, and somehow connected even to the myth of the high mountain, of the idea of this kind of close relation with God and temper of the man there. Literally, from an environmental point of view, the hungriest, the angriest in a way, at least the ones that would go at greater length than the softer ones that had already met with the riches, with the advantages of civilization, at least in their loot and in their exchanges. So the Kimak khaganate was the largest. Right? At the same time, it was, however, the most precarious among this Turkic state formations. Because, again, there wasn't much surplus locally to maintain it stable. And other powers further west were substantially more powerful and well-based already, going through the aforementioned transition towards a more kind of stable, sedentarized power. Now, the Kimaks not only raised cattle in the steppes, traditionally, as their way of life, they also began, by imitation, to build impregnable strongholds with high walls and deep moats. Right? They began understanding that, at least in order to maintain a more firm power, they had to spread further the art of encastration. And if you had looked at their forces as humble the average, of course, Kimak as a horse archer would look, you would have really been impressed by their armor. Right? This had not changed definitely much from the previous Turkic models, but nevertheless was particularly impressive. The Kimak armors supplied their warriors at this point, thanks to this net of castles and associated production with local craftsmen and subjects and so on. The panoply consisted, at least, of pointed helmets, either forged or riveted, of steel sections with mail tip-pads. The warrior torso was also protected by mail that, as we've seen, had been spreading mostly from the most sedentarized areas since the beginning of the millennium. But of course, it was also supplemented with a lamellar cuirass that becomes a bit like the standard, has already become the standard at this point in the steppe, made of a set of attached together plates, long spears, broadswords and sabers, small battle axes, flails, besides the indispensable powerful Turkic composite bows and the arrows were characteristic of the Kimak armament, which tells you also how somehow diversified it really was. We've seen all these kind of weapons, and especially the broadswords, the sabers, the flails, right, appearing in some flails would actually be anti-armor specifically, but there were also other ones used exactly as literally for even whipping the enemy. But the concept being still that the average wealth in the heart of the steppe was poor per capita, and the necessity of having broadswords and sabers. It doesn't matter how some of these were, massive weapons, also substantially useful against armored opponents, were still typical of a much more kind of hit and run kind of a profile. That is typical of the Turks. You have the spears naturally being handled by the heavier guys, crashing as literal knights into one another with horrendously powerful, shocking, and penetration capacities. But also the general profile is the one of a typical Central Asian people, right? The battle axes, as small as they are, at least some are substantially effective, even against armor. There is all a specific mentality around the fact that even the youth had to be able to harass the enemy by pulling their horse tails and going literally as close as him in that regard, and even hitting him with this kind of more blunt trauma force to show as initiates that they could approach the most armored as youths, again, even if they were maybe descended from some of the most prestigious lords, because they had to prove they had the spiritual capacity, moral force to risk that much. It was an incredibly cruel and vicious way of training. And in any case, the capacity of chopping specifically broadswords, sabers against unarmored opponents, for not talking about the hail of arrows that rained everywhere, that would make again these battlefields a true hell. Right, the round shields are sometimes used. It had been, as we've seen, a thing mostly for protecting yourself, your back in with extra, layers, something. Let's put it in this way, quite brutally. But also because on horseback, but also because the men-at-arms would be stormtroopers. Right, they would storm the aforementioned strongholds, climbing the walls, crossing the moats, and at close range, everybody is very vulnerable against stones, javelins, and so on. And these guys have to have some extra protection. That works well in the case of a shield, rather than taking hits that, as we've seen, can be at that point quite heavy, even if you are to absorb, even if you have a laminar armor such as a literal stone, or even maybe a javelin that can be thrown at that distance with greater precision and greater force, for example, hitting the joints of armor. So really something that put in critical danger many men-at-arms throughout all the Middle Ages, even when much more sophisticated missile weapons were around. So needless to say, this was an incredibly also primitive and somehow poor world. So we're talking about the very elite, right? We know that likely the cavalry, especially because of the hail of arrows, the elite cavalry at least would have some sort of kilted leather or thick felt bars for the horses, and this thing will survive further. Look at the Seljuks, etc. These things had already been around from quite a while, but they start becoming even a bit more generalized together with this kind of encapsulation. You have partially feudalism quite primitively appearing, with some sort of proto-heraldry of some sort connected to the forces, in mythology of the steppes and whatever. The steppes of Minussinsk, that is today's Caucasia basically, were the homeland of even a more primitive and somehow even backward but very warlike people, the Kyrgyzs, who in the 9th century, or even earlier actually, had refused to subordinate to the Khagans of Central Asia, they had maintained this kind of more fanatic and individual profile to some considerable success, right? In fact, the Kyrgyzs spread from their native hollow to the vast southern lands, right? Sometimes these peoples emerge from, again, maybe a single valley, or at least some areas that sometimes we don't even know with clarity. But exactly because they had been living at the margins, at the outskirts, again, as the bigger khaganates began to slightly kind of soften up, gentrify, it would immediately swarm, exploiting into their territories, exploiting this kind of weakness. So much so that they managed to go as far as crushing the Uyghurs in the east, right? And this had been a fine civilization in the steppes at the point with interesting intersections, even the previous Indo-European peoples having substantial Chinese influence as well, and conquered even Mongolia and Tuva, extending the power of their rulers, the Adzo as they were called, to the eastern limits of the Kazakh steppes and the Baikal area. Right, so these are some, as you understand, of the most hardcore Central Asian territories. They are some of the wildest, the kind of the least hospitable, but at the same time tempering these warriors along the way. If anything, however, the Kyrgyz Empire wouldn't last long, because after just 100 years, such vast but scarcely populated and productive lands were of literally no use to the same Kyrgyzs anymore, right? These people, as you know, had a life. They exist still today. They went on still ruling southern Siberia. Rather, it was a bit more kind of appealing for many centuries, right? While the Kimak state, that, as we've seen, was somehow more refined, more civilized, collapsed fairly soon instead. So they sheltered themselves. They maintained a substantially traditional lifestyle. They wouldn't achieve much of a greater power that they had before, but still they went on. Right, then we have the Kipchaks, right, the Kumans, as well as a number of other tribes set up on their own. We will talk about them, their descendants, also later in other episodes. But these forces, right, give you an idea of how many peoples were really swarming around within this Turkic-dominated steppe without rest, in a way, and just constantly being on each other's throat. Speaking about the Kyrgyz panoply, well, as I was saying before, there's not a radical difference from the one of the Kimaks, right? However, there are still some distinctive traits that can be attemptably attributed. For example, the Kyrgyz helmets were not particularly advanced technically compared to the one of the Kimaks, right? Mail was apparently unknown, or at least less spread than in the West, which meant that lamellar armor was definitely more typical, more characteristic. I made a video about lamellar armor, and there I explain all the various vicissitudes, like the comparisons with mail and all this stuff, so I will not be repeating myself. In any case, this seemed to be better suited for these people. There was a certain archaic, primitive character, as we were saying before, of the Kyrgyz weaponry that so, for example, the use of organic armor, such as wood or bone, right, or these kind of things that really are, that are to be found up to very late in time in Siberia, and up to the 20th century, were beautiful panoplies made literally of bone, right, or other organic material, because again, leather or wood or was a thing, right? Think about Belisarius horsemen in Italy in the 6th century that literally had used wooden armor because, hey, it's the early Middle Ages. There is hardly much metal around, or at least it costs really too much at some point. I mean, put together a decent equipment without essentially losing on some other broader power for the entire fort. So this character means partially less and less updated defense. The Kyrgyzs, in this sense, had a different offensive culture at the same time, right? When you look at, for example, the wooden elements of armor, you would say brassards, shoulder pieces, and greaves, right? So literally, that's the level of poverty. The Kyrgyzs did not use flails and maces, which sounds like pretty less kind of offensive in against armor in the first place. Battle axes, small battle axes, were widespread, though. They're not used only against armor, admittedly, but this still meant that there was. In any case, the important weapons there, sabers, broadswords, but swords in general were widely used. This tells us something interesting. First of all, the fact it was much greater chopping around that corresponds to, again, this lesser level of armor available in the first place, but likely also a greater wealth, say, more homogeneous wealth distribution. In other words, this happened often in some cultures. You have, let's say, richer peoples, but in which sometimes the elites really own everything, and so the backbone of the forces are somehow not even so well protected. The Kyrgyzs do not have this dramatic punching power capacity, especially towards the west, but they still remain more, say, more warlike because they have, more equally distributed wealth, and so they're, generally speaking, acting more cooperatively with a balance. Again, that is not, let's say, necessarily a positive thing, right? Still, they remained, as we've seen, in somehow not necessarily marginal, but partly depressed areas, but freer, right? And that's why they also maintain apparently some more traditional outlook, right? Because they do not overachieve, but at least they are more, they are freer individuals, right? This doesn't mean that the Kyrgyz elites weren't brutally authoritarian, ferocious, like it's typical of the steppes. This is still very an impositively oligarchic world in many ways, but among these peoples still things work a bit more compactly, or from an horizontal and not a vertical point of view. We find, in fact, even speaking of the elites, some among the Kyrgyz weapon, fine blades imported from Central Asia and Iran, which show even, still a capacity to pick from some of the finest metallurgical armament cultures out there, right? And for practical purpose, not just showing off, right? Parades, which naturally wasn't. There were some ceremonial weapons too that were somehow used slightly different from the battlefield, but always bear in mind that only very extremely elaborate weapons can be really thought to have been merely ceremonial, right? Many ceremonial weapons that are present everywhere are ceremonial, but you could absolutely use them to kill and fight and make them as efficient as they can be for what they are designed, if they're still balanced enough for that purpose. This is the case. Quite interesting are also the metal ornaments from the Kimak and Kyrgyz panoplies, namely the belt plates and horse harness buckles, meaning that there was an important attention towards still this kind of wealth, the capacity of boasting it, and in part even carrying it with the same warrior, not just accumulating, treasuring them, but always redistributing or at least being brought with them to show, to be more readily identifiable from a social point of view. We've seen it in other videos about Turco-Mongolian warfare, that such differences were quite codified, right? And that it's also typically steppish, let's put it in this way, to ostentate wealth in a world where there is really a few, just for the sake sometimes of showing off and even being considered a more capable warrior, but also because literally they, given their nomadic style, they had to bring such stuff with them. So aside from the general impediment that sometimes such maybe an overload of equipment could entail, still were functional to their purpose. In any case, to summarize, especially about the Kyrgyz, is we find kind of still more heroic culture, mostly based on still the individuality of the freeman by some degree, poor equipment, even organic armor, as wood, bone, whatever, with a lot of chopping, right? A lot of swords, even among the average people, right? Now, in the 10th to 11th century, and I will have to make more specific videos about this, because I talk about Seljuk warfare, especially explaining part of this, but there is even the before, in fact. What you find, famously enough, in a number of states was seized from Islamic nobles of Iranian and Arabian origins by Turkic warlords, and vice versa. That is to say, certain chiefs of independent tribes, as much as the ones from the sanitary ones, began to buy slave soldiers known as gulams, right? This process happened for a number of reasons. The first one was just perhaps in insight, the fact that the golden age of Islam was fading. The Arabs had their shot, civilization, and now they were softening up by a degree, and they needed more foreign troops, right? More ethnic contingents from across the boundaries of the caliphate, as we have seen in many videos about different areas, that there had been warlike people, the same Arabs, at least in the Arabian Peninsula, but even areas around the Caspian, the Arcanian Mountains, the Caucasus, were substantial. The Laimi, for example, that had been used as foot troops, right? As some of the most famous mercenaries, after all, in a world of still much more advanced warfare, right? With heavy cavalry, combined armed tactics, and mostly, these guys coming just as tribesmen, but they foot troops, right, with axes, javelins, but still being warlike enough to be involved, like in at least the expansion that they created some territorial power on their own and kept being hired as far as Egypt, right? But this was not enough anyway. That belonged to again, to the early age of Islam, right? At this point, the Turks were pushing against the caliphal frontiers, they could inject these troops either as slave soldiers being literally bought, but at the same time as raiders themselves. You know the history of the Ghulams, the Mamluks, etc. Some of these people went there to become technically slaves, right? Because their status was actually not that bad as slave soldiers. They were even better off than the average freemen in a way, so it's not slavery in the sense of chains or whatever. They were just bound, of course, to their masters that had the right of life and death on them, but it was not very different just from a sort of clienterly military retinue of some sort, and for these guys to, again, being hungry and warlike, being rewarded with lands in the most developed places in the world within the caliphate, having come from a life of, again, primitively brutal misery, right, and massive bloodshed and so on, because that's the thing that they knew how to do best, right? So in part, these Ghulams took over, right? As you know, they hijacked the same local powers. They made the fortune of this or that caliph, and they also were ferociously put against one another. They were not just Turks. They mostly associated on ethnic base. There were, I don't know, Nubians. There were people really coming from the broader, the based Islamic world, stretching from the Atlantic to the Indus Valley. But the Turks were definitely the ones that, again, keeping to poor against the frontiers, and as it would keep happening later on, even with the Mongols, that surely contributed in part even to this further destabilization of the area, but also the increase in the warlikeness and some kind of even more military improvement, compaction, would be just always available and always on the move and always habituated from quite a long time. But it would be very interesting to track, like in the very early, since the very early Middle Ages or even before, used to participate, after all, to the military expeditions of the great sedentary civilization, right? Every time, a big regional scale campaign was being carried out, well, people from Central Asia, if this was occurring, I don't know, in Mesopotamia or wherever, even in Constantinople, etc., would simply hear that, they would be interested, would arrive, they would constitute these important contingents, sometimes even heavy troops. In fact, the Ghulams at least would become very often the bodyguards of the various Islamic rulers. They would make up the elite, right, of mercenaries, depending on the local lords and not essentially part of the local, instead, say, subjects, freemen, that were usually less warlike, as we've seen, but they were also, they would provide with militias and so on, so they would tend to counter, even, of course, at the following of other noblemen who wanted to take over the central power that in the Islamic world was always very tormented, to say the least, because of many reasons, all right? Not just a distrust towards any earthly authority, it was a negative bias, right, a sort of usurpers of God's rule, but the fact that Islam didn't have a priestly class, so basically all the, say, moral and material effort was concentrated in a single elite that detained a bit much of all the power. Right, in the Latin Germanic world, it was this different dichotomy in which you had the church and the regnum, let's say, that would constantly dialogue and boost forward sort of the necessity of cooperation and kind of building up something that took more time but was arguably more stable. The Islamic world was as huge, as actually more even religiously factional, sectary, fragmented, conflictual. And it necessitated constantly of these fresh troops that, after all, they could simply recruit, north of the Iranian plateau, north of the Caucasus, because that's literally where they lived, and they were relatively close in that sense. From the steppes, very Central Asia, you have, even considering the shape of the earth, always the choice, the ideal place where to move. Either where do I go? Do I go to China? Do I go to Persia? Do I go to Europe? So the Ghulams would make their own fortune. Mostly they were the product of the traumatically violent steppe reality where these peoples crush one another and they enslaved the survivors, any kind of rape, massacres, whatever. These people were sold cheaply, right? That's the other thing from the steppes, that everything is so cheap in the first place. But definitely not the military qualities of these horsemen that are exactly what the Islamic establishment is seeking for. So this would be a vicious circle, because once you settled the gulams, this would gentrify and would even start opposing the authority, and so you had to call other of these primitives born and bred in the steppes to say, okay, well, you're the new one, the new bot, with 101 that doesn't, knows more kind of the devolved situation politically speaking, as far as the local mechanisms are concerned. So that will stay loyal and faithful, also because he's a slave. So technically, he's being ransomed in a way through the same military service. This is a very important civilizational aspect. I mean, the idea that these troops were redeemed by their service, very often converted to Islam in the process. So there was a totalization of that kind of spiritual renewal, rejuvenation, and rebirth, literally, that was actually very strongly felt among the peoples of the steppes, right? The entire mentality of a 10th century Turk is, again, that there is a spring of life out there in the steppes, in the highest mountains, in contact with God, of a new race of warriors that constantly emanates and is ready to go out there purely to take over the world because of their spiritual and genetical superiority. Right? This was already the case for the Indo-Europeans, and so on. So the idea of having failed in the steppes means that you're dead. Right? I cannot stress enough psychologically what this means. This is true also in the sanitary world, because you're done for anyway. Right? But the idea is that you have failed to that point, to the universal order, because those who are righteous and pure can never fail by definition. Instead, Islam was telling them, I give you another opportunity to be at the service, by the way, of the greatest power in the world. Like, it could be, the Abbasid Caliphate, or wherever they went serving. And you are reborn with an Islamic name, you're a different person. You're redeemed, but what this takes is you have to give your life for your master, because you're still a slave, and you have now just the opportunity of being saved through a new military chance, right, to prove your superiority, your divine worthiness on the field, right? And if you die in battle, if you manage at least to transfigure in battle, the gates of heaven are open for you. Right. This is basically, again, as I countlessly say, the same identical religion since ever. People still literally believe that there was monotheism, that the terrible Abrahamic religions were different. They were the same. They were at best a very slightly and differently flavored, inclination, not variation, not modification, of the same identical religion. Right, and you have been mentally brainwashed, right, to believe that this was different, right? That was like that there is a structuralistic, universal, which is the mere essence for which there cannot be, right, in the purest traditional meaning, any such thing in the first place, and you still keep believing that, so to carve your own niche, because you're not better as a human to be able to take over the entire thing, which corresponds, in fact, to the fall of mankind, and its weakness, right? The lack of power and actual human dignity by any point of view. These people were completely different. Like 1,000 years ago, people still believed it. They believed this everywhere. They believed it in Christian Europe. They believed it in the pagan steppes. They believed it in the Islamic Caliphate. It was the same identical religion that everybody had always learned in the same identical way, because the meaning is only one, right? And there cannot be any other by definition. So the for again, especially those who feel that war like dimension so closely, because they have seen people being cut to pieces in front of their eyes since they were children on a regular basis, and they have been bred exclusively to become to chop other people to pieces on a regular basis as their the sole purpose of their existence. The entire concept of failing and still being alive is actually quite problematic, right? So this sense of fate and devotion is sublimated to an unprecedented level. And in fact, these converted Turks were notoriously the single most fanatic Muslims that ever lived, arguably, because those who feel inferior and are complex about their past, the one of their backward civilization, whatever happened to them, are always the most zealot, right? The ones that must prove something, that they're not what everybody knows fundamentally what they are. And so the demotivation was as fiercely brutal as we know, right? So the way it is intertwined with the Caliphate, with the Seljuks later on, is just still after all a failure, right? A fragmentation of the same Caliphate, of the same Seljuk Empire that was basically overlapping to it. But it still has to do with the spring of this very universal imperial ecumenic Catholic belief. There would be so much to tell, because the influence of the Gulams, especially the Turkic ones, even in the reinvigoration of a sort of feudal chivalric mentality, the certain symbolisms, even the eagles, there is this thing around in Constantinople. There is an influence, especially there, from all these waves of at this point Turkic populations that kept hammering the frontiers of the empire, being crushed at least most of the times until the major blow of Manzikert. But not even that was, as we know, it had to end in the first blow. No. Right, in the following century, basically Byzantines had retaken everything and just miraculously arrived. And then other things arrived, namely, the Fourth Crusade, which was the actual deal. Because otherwise, remember, the fiercest, most powerful enemies of Constantinople were in the west, not much in the east. Right, these Turkic peoples were dramatically fragmented, never really posed a threat. Right, it was never until after at least the Fourth Crusade, like a Turkic siege of Constantinople, unless we look at the Avars, by the way, but those came from at least Europe. So whoever crashed against the Theodosian walls at least failed. There had been the Cumans. There were other peoples surely close to this, but never underestimate how the steppe, and we've seen it about the Turks, had emerged as a broken space. Right, where it's not that these peoples were not fierce or dangerous or threatening, but they fundamentally were coming out again of a world that had been disordered since the end of the great empires of the beginning of the first millennium AD, and the composition of the Catholic ecumenic empire had escaped anyone. No other empire had ever been able to emulate what the Romans had done, and the world was perceiving the angst of its own aging and the decay and the collapse and all these barriers of again kind of spurs of this people takes over this other whatever, but it never lasts, right? And to the steppes this was even more anxiously felt, because again the level of violence needed habitually in everyday life to achieve that was there, but it was so disorderly, it was so broken. It's not that force wasn't there. It was not recompacted, it was not orderly, it was not put in a form. The substance of humanity is always there. What the imperial perfection is about is the rational hierarchical order, right? It's that sense of cohesive spiritual power that had brought the repristination of the Golden Age. This is what all these peoples are really after. And that's why the Turks, for example, are so unspeakably obsessed with Constantinople. Like, they settle in Asia Minor after massacre, together with lots of other people, telling the truth. That they know that's the land of Rome. And the ultimate objective is Constantinople, at least from what they know, because that's mostly all what they see. And there's literally no other purpose in their own existence but taking Constantinople, because you cannot objectively rule the world from any other place but the center of what they thought was the center of the world. And no other thing makes sense in the entire universe except that. Right? This is the actual mindset, at least in terms of what we can understand with our own ways, is hopelessly, degenerated to an abortive level of human indignity in the 21st century. But let's say the concept properly here is that what we see is that their entire mindset is wired on this, right? The idea, again, that the steppes has always known much more about the sanitary world, because that's, at the end of the day, what they revolved around, while the sanitary world, by also legitimately, didn't really give a damn about them. They didn't even know they existed until they arrived at their gates, is exclusively based on this idea. Right, descending from, as we've seen with the Kyrgyz, from unknown, terrible, nightmarish, despicable places, even from a sheer environmental, geographical point of view, out of literally nothing. Like in Mitra's legion, that is actually born out of a stone, right, to eventually become the sun. That was what I believed it would happen. And so that superhuman effort that had to bring the world to be recomposed under a single rule, right? The only purpose that mankind, at least the mankind worth of this name, really had. Ruling the entire world. Not like this bitches today that whine because, oh my god, there are the imperialists, the terrible United States, whoever, nobody reached again after the Roman Empire anything remotely close in a Catholic ecumenic sense. But the idea is, of course, that if you counter those who simply, in virtue of their own superiority, because that's the only law that tradition knows, rule the world, you're just a pathetic bitch whining in a culturally underdeveloped corner, and that feels all the moral, cultural, personal inferiority from the familial background, from the national background, and all these other, again, abortions of what was the one, right? Pieces of dirt with a flag on. That's, the degeneration of what any traditional warrior would have believed the purpose of mankind would have been. And that's what mostly human beings, we can't call them like this nowadays, because it's correct, at least human means dirt, where you should call them man, right? Human means coming from dirt, dirty, which is the actually accurate terminology. So barely anything of the divine that they're supposed to, of course, to try to reach, and they're simply accelerating just in the other direction. And that basically is the only sole purpose of any person worth of this name. It's difficult to enter in this mindset, right? I understand that the average person literally feels all the phobia of the recognition of his inferiority just disclosed in front of them, because that's the only reason why they make up for it with bullshit. But if you want to learn history, this is at least the first thing you must forcibly learn, and nobody gives a fuck about people's opinion. People's opinions are worthless. Here we're talking about God, right, which is a completely different thing. And then all the rest. If you don't want to learn this, don't learn anything. I mean, actually, don't do anything with your life, because it's completely useless anyway, right? This is radically important. If one doesn't get this, it's over. It's over forever. And so just even get the fuck out of here, because nobody needs you, really. Now, we have talked about this Ghulam's moral impetus as far as the adoption of Islam, right? So this new totalizing force that at least had tried to restore, from their own point of view, through the Dar al-Islam, the ecumenicity of the world, and that was basically the first at least from this kind of Central Western Eurasian perspective, like at least the main religion they actually met, some of these people were actually Christian. Some of them were Jews. We've seen them with the Khazars, etc. So whatever their version of that really was. But they knew that, right? In Mongolian Kyrgyz times, as you know, even in his family, there were Christians, there were Jews. That they knew about what, again, was happening in the rest of the world, right? So the result was actually quite imperfect at the beginning, because definitely a Turk was not exactly well versed in Islamic commandments, right? And again, it was a completely different, say at least a radically different moral system by a degree, right? For which, again, there were two different levels of approach towards the same moral aspect of religion. That's why we confuse that, because we do not reason in terms like there are different values in mankind compared to a single universal absolute standard. We say, no, simply those guys were pagan and those guys were Muslim. And so how we wash our hands of any human responsibility, right? That's the BS. In any case, the problem there was making, again, an Abbasid coping with, I don't know, a Kimak, right? Which is quite fascinating in terms of, mental profiles. But to a degree, it was successful, at least, because the Gulams, at least, were particularly prized, well employed. They began like to serve in also with, just think about all the level of military development of the caliphal forces in general. We've seen how the Arabs had invaded and Ciscaucasia, and even pushed the Khazars further north towards the Volga. Right, so there was even a capacity of the Senators, of course. They had normally the upper hand, militarily speaking, against the steppes. So these peoples, however, the Gulams, formed the bridge between that civilized world and then the barbarity of the steppe, and establishing a constant connection, or at least reviving it compared to the one that had already been existing for quite a while to that point, in functionalizing the creation of a more professional, permanent elite that would take on eventually some kind of seigneurial and feudal character, whereas the Abbasids, as you know, had, the Caliphate at large, at least the Islamic states, had maintained essentially a Roman Sasanian level of centralization, of bureaucracy, and so also some degree of civic capacity. It's a big word throughout all the early, say, Islamic era, but at least some centers were kept balanced in that way to a degree. Now instead, as you know, with the Seljuks, the thing opens to essentially to a feudal era, right? These are relatively less feudal, at least the Caliphate, relatively less feudal eras than Europe. The same goes for, also the Byzantine Paranoia is not what happens in Latin Germanic Europe, but they're very similar. So much so that during the Crusades in the 11th century, aside from the ferocious hatred and people scorched, skinned, and burned alive, the Latin knights and the Seljuk ones would recognize in one another a sort of, peer. Or at least they estimated each other's equestrian, zootechnic, and chivalrous kind of capacities, knightly capacities, and they spoke, the same language of the sword to a substantial degree. Right, this aspect is particularly important. So as ardent this kind of faith, attitude towards the new religion of the Turkic fighters really was, so the interaction of the steppe and sedentary traditions engendered in Central Asia and Eastern Iran. Right, there are interesting histories there. The Ghaznavids, we will talk about them at some point, promise. I made a video about Western Iranian warfare during the High Middle Ages, I have to make the one about the Eastern one. I'm preparing something on Mesopotamia, actually, and the Jazeera, actually, so a bit also towards Syria as well, probably coming out soon. So we will go step by step, just to give you a dimension of how more, for example, much more Central Asian that era would really remain historically. Whereas Western Iran was a bit more centralized, a bit more urbanized, developing literally, it's a very vast region, so you can see this kind of differences from one end to another. This is observable naturally in forms of weapons and military equipment. For example, helmets with camels carried on the Sogdian tradition, right? That was, as we've seen, expressing a bit this concerning need now of pairing itself from these new waves of Turks, from a more kind of stabilized, sanitarized, in that case even urban tradition. And so this impoverished but still very hungry Turks that had remained at that point at the outskirts of even the steppes civilizational standards, and now swarmed en masse, right? And the need of to protect all from this massive waves of arrows had brought to this kind of further protection that otherwise in Iranian times had not quite been there. So defensive armor combined a lamellar mail or quilted armor with long mail or quilted oversleeves, and a quilted hem. Right, that's what you could see as a non-Iranian, the Persian, say, more narrowly, knight at this point, in this Ghulam times. The cavalry shields were round, those of the infantry were large and oval. There is the distinct necessity now protect, even for the infantry, that starts specializing by some degree, or at least now even the militias of Syria and the Levant in general and Mesopotamia start to cope more directly with these new waves of hordes of Huns, of Turks, that yes were a bit what they had been meeting in Hunnic times in similar ways, except now the Ghulams were literally taking over the system from the within. The Sassanians had managed to keep the Eftalites out, while that were actually mostly Iranians, perhaps. They were led by the very Turkic elites there. Eventually were crushed by the Sassanians together with the Gök Turks, but they had been kept out. Now the Ghulams, as Turks, were spreading every freaking where, and the necessity to cope against these horse archers en masse stimulated surely also the creation of the further development, if anything, of crossbows that existed for quite a long time in first millennium BC, and that now were just being implemented, in part for coping also against these other thick militias, because a bit of say economic and demographic revival was happening in the century world, as you know, towards the 11th century. But especially against cavalry, like crossbows more than else are anti-cavalry weapons, and this is what we tend to forget. Like the Turks did use crossbows themselves, telling the truth, and generally speaking, especially in this more kind of not much technically advanced world, of course, by some degree, also polyurcetically, right? A Ghulam in Mesopotamia, in Persia, would meet with many more castles than the ones that had been, as we've seen, developing as sort of moats in the steppes. But would also, in part, even, say, not really lose much of their archery capacity, but still adapt to other types of warfare as well in between. Armor was increasing, finally, also in these worlds as well. So again, the crossbow was designed in part to that. There were other, let's say, other things they would take care of. The tops of the boots made of hard leather served as greaves, for example. So even more kind of, padded protection by a degree. We've seen the bardment starting with, even in the steppes, the Kimaks and so on, more frequently, because it was starting to profile itself as a kind of heavier type of warfare, even whenever they would venture into worlds like the one of the 10th, 11th century, were really taking off, right, in terms of also military power in the sanitary world. The steeds were fully protected by bars, in fact, of painted leather. Was better than nothing. Many blows, let's say the arrows that had spent most of their kinetic energy or were not really hitting at the right angle could be absorbed by this armor, padded armor, without much trouble. Find the rich array of offensive weapons comprising spearing, javelins, sabers, swords and daggers, maces of different types, battle axes, picks, bows and arrows, slings and arbaleths. All these, again, are definitely showing you something more composite, something more sanitary. We're talking about the gulams that were literally in the sanitary world. And again, their tactics wouldn't be radically altered, right? If you look at, for example, how the Egyptians fought during the Crusades. I mean, they were much more Western or sanitary looking, right? Instead, the Seljuks, the areas of Mesopotamia, mostly at that point the Seljuk were highly Persified, coming from the Iranian plateau as an established power, still fighting essentially in a very steppe way, right? In a steppe you can make this kind of balance even compared to what they were before this later phase, but they're basically that, right? There are this radically hyper-armored, numerical and qualitative elite of mostly of the Gulam forces that were also well armored in a distributed armored in a also kind of this redistributary fashion, with all the surplus from sedentary organized civilization, administration, and so on. And then a swarm of throwaway horse archers that would literally pave the way, massacring, raping, whatever, burning, skinning, whatever. Everybody they found in front of them would be there just for the loot. Nobody could rely on them except for harassing the enemy continuously, throwing arrows after arrows after arrows, rising all this dust, not showing, but screening for essentially the movements of the bigger, heavier elite. Could be just 1 kilometer away, as, I don't know, 2 weeks away, but you wouldn't practically realize, because in between all you had is this freaking horse archers that are basically just a constant pain in the behind, because they are alone by themselves ineffective. They just wear you out. However, they're nerve-wracking. Somebody of course is going to fall because of their shots, but fundamentally the ultimate shock power is the elite. And very often still these, as we've seen also in the Crusade videos, that not even the elite could crush, right, adequately the greatest force. I mean, there are great, of course, victories like Manzikert, like Hattin, etc. We'll see all this stuff better even at some other point, because some of them I discussed, others we still have to, but they are evergreens, as you know. But again, it's all the process, right? This relentless process that was happening in the steps behind the screens that I want to leave you with, right? What had brought these peoples from, again, places that you didn't even know they existed, right? But that eventually made things happening for, let's say, the Westerners to see, right? To be observed, to be recorded, to make the politics, the strategy, the tactics of the Crusades and other in other worlds. And these peoples, like the Oghuz, leaving, for example, a hell of an ethno-linguistic trace. Much of the descendants of also other peoples we discussed make up still a substantial amount of population, certain Western Turkic countries today. So we start seeing also from this point, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, destabilization of much of what we know as the modern world, the modern identities, because the steppes also at some point finished moving, right? At least after the Mongols. Yes, there were other changes over time, we'll see part of them, but at least some of the major ethnic settlements, etc., or as we've seen the establishment within certain boundaries. We've seen the Kyrgyz before began at this point, in this relatively obscure time of the 9th to the 11th century. The Seljuks emerging from, essentially betraying the Oghuz and stemming from them, and as a relic, and coming around and then establishing the massive empire that fragmented, however, immediately, as well, at least in this various dynastic principalities. And so again, everything here is the product of a much more complex mess that, as historians, we try to make sense of didactically in the best way we can. But that requires, again, videos this long, because there is really not another way to tell the story of them. And so we go on with these stories. We, as you understand here, we move from a bit more west, a bit more east in the steppes, but there are lots of protagonists here that are really a bit overlooked, right, over time, and there are really lots of different populations we mentioned today, such as the Kumans, right? But the others, think about the Moldovians. Think about there are. We will name them eventually, from areas, even like Azerbaijan, or they were a bit more in the frontier world, right? And we will see the clash between the Rus and the Mongols, the rise of the Golden Horde, and of the Ottomans later on, and more, right? Uzbekistan, the Timurids, the Zaporozhian, even this Slavic reality that remains, again, suspense between various ways of people, so much that as Slavs they start living as them, even though they're Slavs, right? But there are really lots of other populations that, like the Circassians, the Kalmyks, etc., that are the Yakuts, the Khanty-Mansi, the Kyrgyz. We will have to really look quite far at some point to appreciate them. But for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.